Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Chapter 14.
The Fifth Crusade had ended, as we have seen, without producing any other benefit to Palestine than a deep depression in the minds of the Turks from the knowledge that the weak dynasty of the Greeks had been replaced by a power of greater energy and resolution. The famine also, which about this time desolated the territories of the Egyptian Sultan, and the contests between the remaining Atabeks and the successors of Saladin, crippled the efforts of the Moslems, while the courageous activity of John de Brienne defeated the attempts of Saif ed-Din. Nevertheless, many bloody disputes concerning the succession of Antioch and the fierce rivalry of the orders of the Temple and Hospital contributed to shake the stability of the small Christian dominion that remained. Each year, 2 regular voyages of armed and unarmed pilgrims took place from Europe to the Holy Land. These were called the Passagium Martii, or the Spring Passage, and the Passagium Johannis, or the Summer Passage, which occurred about the festival of St. John. A continual succor was thus afforded to Palestine, and that the spirit of crusading was by no means extinct in Europe is evinced by the extraordinary fact of a crusade of children having been preached and adopted towards the year 1213. Did this fact rest alone upon the authority of Alberic of Three Fountains Abbey, we might be permitted to doubt its having taken place, for his account is, in several particulars, evidently hypothetical. But so many coinciding authorities exist that belief becomes matter of necessity. The circumstances are somewhat obscure, but it seems certain that 2 monks, with the design of profiting by a crime then too common, the traffic in children, induced a great number of the youth of both sexes to set out from France for the Holy Land, habited as pilgrims, with the scrip and staff. 2 merchants of Marseille, accomplices in the plot, as it would seem, furnished the first body of these misguided children with vessels, which, of course, were destined to transport them for sale to the African coast. Several of the ships were wrecked on the shores of Italy, and every soul perished, but the rest pursued their way and accomplished their inhuman voyage. The 2 merchants, however, were afterward detected in a plot against the Emperor Frederick and met the fate they deserved. Another body, setting out from Germany, reached Genoa after immense difficulties. And there, the Genoese, instead of encouraging their frantic enthusiasm, wisely commanded them to evacuate their territory, on which they returned to their homes, and though many died on the road, a great part arrived in safety, and escaped the fate which had overtaken the young adventurers from France. When Innocent III heard of this crusade, he is reported to have said, "While we sleep, these children are awake." And it is more than probable that his circumstance convinced him that the zealous spirit which had moved all the expeditions to the Holy Land was still active and willing. Certain it is that he very soon afterward sent round an encyclical letter, calling the Christian world once more to arms against the Moslems. Indulgences were spread, and extended in their character. A council of Lateran was held, and Innocent himself declared his intention of leading the warriors of Christ to the scene of his crucifixion. De Courson, an English monk who had become cardinal, preached the new crusade with all the pomp of a Roman prelate, and a great number of individuals were gathered together for the purpose of succoring Palestine. But the kings of the earth had now more correct views of policy, and policy never encourages enthusiasm except as an instrument. Only one king, therefore, could be found to take the cross. This was Andrew, monarch of Hungary, and the dukes of Austria and Bavaria, with a multitude of German bishops and nobles, joined his forces and advanced to Spalatro. Innocent III was by this time dead, but the expedition sailed in Venetian ships to Cyprus, and thence, after having given somewhat too much rain to enjoyment, proceeded to Acre, carrying with it a large reinforcement from France and Italy. The Saracens had heard less of this crusade than of those which had preceded it, and were therefore less prepared to oppose it. The Christian army advanced with success, and many thousands of the infidels felt the European steel. But the Crusaders, not contented with plundering their enemies, went on to plunder their friends, and serious divisions began, as usual, to show themselves, which were only healed by the influence of the clergy, who turned the attention of the soldiers from pillage and robbery to fasts and pilgrimages. When the host was once more united, its exertions were directed to the capture of the fort built by the Saracens on Mount Thabor. After overcoming infinite difficulties in the ascent of the mountain, the Latins found themselves opposite the fortress. The soldiers were enthusiastic and spirited, and it is more than probable that one gallant attack would have rendered the greatest benefit to the Christian cause by obtaining possession of such an important point. The leaders, however, seized with a sudden fear of being cut off, abandoned their object without striking a blow, and retired to Acre. The rest of the season was passed in excursions, by which the Christians obtained many prisoners and much spoil, and in pilgrimages, wherein thousands were cut to pieces by the Saracens. The kings of Cyprus and Hungary then turned their course to Tripoli, where the first died, and the Hungarian monarch was suddenly seized with the desire of returning to his own dominions, which he soon put in execution, notwithstanding the prayers and solicitations of the Syrian Christians. Still, the Latins of Palestine were not left destitute. The Duke of Austria remained with all the German crusaders, and the next year a large reinforcement arrived from Cologne. Nor would these have been so tardy in coming, had they not paused upon the coast of Portugal to succor the queen of that country against the Moors. The efforts of the Christians had proved hitherto so fruitless for the recovery of Jerusalem, while the Saracens could bring vast forces from Egypt continually to the support of their Syrian possessions, that the Latins now resolved to strike at the very source of their power. Damietta was supposed to command the entrance of the Nile, and consequently to be the key of Egypt, and thither the Crusaders set sail for the purpose of laying siege to that important city. They arrived in the month of May and landed on the western bank of the river opposite to the town. A tower in the center of the stream, connected with the walls by a strong chain, was the immediate object of attack. But the first attempt was repulsed with great loss, though made by the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Order, and the Germans united. An immense machine of wood was now constructed on board two of the vessels, which, lashed together, were moved across to the point of assault, and after a long and courageous resistance, the garrison of the castle was forced to surrender at discretion. The besieging party then abandoned themselves to joy and revelry. They looked upon the city as taken, and the news of the death of Saif-ed-Din increased their hopes of the complete deliverance of the Holy Land. The victories which Saif-ed-Din had gained over the Christians were indeed but small, nor had he struck any one great blow against the Atabeks, but he had gradually and almost imperceptibly extended his dominions in every direction and left a large territory and full treasury to his successors. His high qualities were different from those of Saladin, and his character was altogether less noble and striking, but he possessed more shrewdness than his brother, and if his mind had not the same capability of expanding, it had more powers of concentration. To Saif-ed-Din succeeded his two sons, Khor-ed-Din and Kamel, the first of whom took possession of Syria and Palestine in peace. But Egypt, which the second had governed for some time, instantly broke out into revolt on the news of his father's death, and had the Franks pushed the war in that country with vigor, greater effects would have been produced than were ever wrought by any preceding crusade. They neglected their opportunity, spent their time in rioting and debauchery under the yet unconquered walls of Damietta, and, after the arrival of large reinforcements from France, England, and Italy, under the Cardinals Pelagius and Corson, the Earls of Chester and Salisbury, and the Counts of Nevers and La Marche, they only changed their conduct from reveling to dissension. At length they awoke from their frantic dreams and prepared to attack the city itself. But before they could accomplish their object, Khor-ed-Din had entered Egypt, put down rebellion, and re-established his brother Kamel in full possession of his authority. The siege of Damietta now became like the first siege of Antioch, a succession of battles and skirmishes. For 3 months, the various nations that composed the besieging force, as well as the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, vied with each other in deeds of glory. Nor were the Saracens behind their adversaries in courage, skill, or resolution. But famine took up the sword against the unhappy people of Damietta. Pestilence soon joined her, and the fall of the city became inevitable. Khor Eddin, fearful that Jerusalem might be turned to a post against him, had destroyed the walls of that town. But now that he saw the certain loss of Damietta and calculated the immense advantages the Christians might thence gain, he, with the best policy, agreed to make a vast sacrifice to save the key of his brother's dominions. Conferences were opened with the Christians, and the Saracens offered on the evacuation of Egypt by the Latins to yield the whole of Palestine, except the fortresses of Montreal and Carac, to restore all European prisoners, and even to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem for the Christians. The King of Jerusalem, the English, the French, and the Germans looked upon their warfare as ended, and their object achieved by the very proposal. But the Cardinal Pelagius, the two military orders, and the Italians opposed all conciliation, contending that no faith was to be put in the promises of infidels. Heaven only knows whether the Saracens would have broken their engagements, or whether calm moderation might not have restored Palestine to the followers of the cross. But moderation was not consulted, and the walls of Damietta were once more attacked. It was no longer difficult to take them, and when the Crusaders entered the city, they discovered nothing but a world of pestilence. Death was in every street, and of 70,000 souls, not 3,000 were found alive. Discord, of course, succeeded conquest, and after having cleansed and purified Damietta, a winter was spent in dissensions, at the end of which a great part of the army returned to Europe, and Jean de Brienne, offended by the arrogance of Pelagius, retired to Acre. Concessions soon brought him back, and hostilities were resumed against the Moslems, but the legate overbore all counsel, and instead of directing their arms towards Palestine, which was now open to them, the Crusaders marched on towards Cairo. The forces of the Sultan had greatly increased, but he still offered peace on conditions as advantageous as those that had been previously proposed. The legate insultingly rejected all terms, wasted his time in inactivity, the Nile rose, the sluices were opened, and Pelagius found himself at once unable to advance, and cut off from his resources at Damietta. There is nothing too mean for disappointed pride, and the legate then sued in the humblest language for permission to return to Acre. The Sultan of Egypt, with admirable moderation, granted him peace, and the King of Jerusalem became one of the hostages that Damietta should be given up. The troops would still have perished for want, had not the noble Sultan been melted by the grief of John of Brienne, who wept while recounting the distress in which he had left his people. The Saracen mingled his tears with those of the hostage king and ordered the army of his enemy to be supplied with food. Damietta was soon after yielded and the hostages exchanged. John of Brienne retired to Acre, wearied of unceasing efforts to recover his nominal kingdom, and Pelagius passed over into Europe, loaded with the hatred and contempt of Palestine. John of Brienne had received the crown of Jerusalem as his wife's dowry, and it was destined that the marriage of his daughter should restore the holy city to the Christians. The Emperor Frederick II had often vowed in the most solemn manner to lead his armies into Palestine, and had as often broken his oath. At length it was proposed to him that he should wed Violante, the beautiful heiress of the Syrian kingdom. And it was easily stipulated that John of Brienne should give up his rights on Palestine to his daughter's husband. Frederick eagerly caught at the idea. By the intervention of the Pope, the treaty was concluded between the king and the emperor, and Violante, having been brought to Europe, was espoused by her imperial lover. Many causes combined to delay the new crusade, though it was preached by two succeeding popes with all the zeal and promises that had led to those that went before. France and Italy remained occupied entirely by intestine dissensions, but England showed great zeal and sent 60,000 men at arms to the field. The emperor collected together immense forces and proceeded to Brundusium. But there, being taken ill of a pestilential disease which had swept away many of his soldiers, he was obliged to return after having put to sea. Gregory IX was now in the papal chair, and wroth with the emperor for many a contemptuous mark of disobedience to the ecclesiastical authority, he now excommunicated him for coming back, however necessary the measure. Frederick was angry, though not frightened, and after having exculpated himself to Europe by a public letter, he sent his soldiers to plunder the Pope's territories while he recovered his health. At length, in 1228, he set sail from Brundusium, still burdened with the papal censure, which he was too much accustomed to bear to feel as any oppressive load. He arrived without difficulty at Acre, but all men wondered that so great an enterprise should be undertaken with so small a force as that which could be contained in 20 galleys, and it soon appeared that Frederick had long been negotiating with Kamel, Sultan of Egypt, who, fearful of the active and ambitious spirit of his brother Khor-Eddin, had entered into a private treaty with the German monarch. The emperor, on his arrival in Palestine, found that the revengeful pope had laid his injunction upon all men to show him no obedience and afford him no aid while under the censure of the church. None, therefore, at first, accompanied him in his march, but his own forces and the Teutonic Knights. The Hospitallers and Templars soon followed, and, too fond of active warfare to remain neuter, joined themselves to the army on some verbal concession on the part of Frederick. About this time Khor-Eddin died, and Kamel, freed from apprehension, somewhat cooled towards his Christian ally. He was, nevertheless, too generous to violate his promises, and after Frederick had advanced some way towards Jerusalem, a treaty was entered into between the German monarch and the Saracens, whereby the Holy City and the greater part of Palestine was yielded to the Christians, with the simple stipulation that the Moslems were to be allowed to worship in the temple, as well as the followers of the cross. Frederick then proceeded to Jerusalem to be crowned, but the conditions he had agreed to had given offense to the Christians of Judea, and the Pope's excommunication still hung over his head. All the services of the church were suspended during his stay. He was obliged to raise the crown from the altar himself and place it on his own brow, and he discovered by messengers from the Sultan of Egypt that some individuals of the military orders had offered to betray him into the hands of the Saracens. Frederick now found it necessary to depart, and after having done justice upon several of the chief contemners of his authority, he set sail for Europe, leaving Palestine in a far more favorable state than it had known since the fatal battle of Tiberias. Soon after the departure of Frederick, a new aspirant to the crown of Jerusalem appeared in the person of Alice, Queen of Cyprus, the daughter of Isabella and Henry, Count of Champagne, and half-sister of Mary, through whom John of Brienne had obtained the throne. Her claims were soon disposed of, for the three military orders, uniting in purpose for once, adhered to the Emperor of Germany, and Alice was obliged to withdraw. After this struggle, the attention of the Christians was entirely turned to the general defense, and the right of the emperor, who had now made his peace with the Pope, was universally recognized. Nevertheless, the truce which he had concluded with Kamel, the Sultan of Egypt, did not in all instances save the Latins of Palestine from annoyance and warfare. The whole country was surrounded by 1,000 petty Mohammedan states not included in the peace, and the Moslems left no opportunity unimproved for the purpose of destroying their Christian neighbors. Their incursions on the Latin territory were incessant, and many large bodies of pilgrims were cut to pieces or hurried away into distant lands as slaves. A truce had been agreed upon also between the Templars and the Sultan of Aleppo, but at the death of that monarch, both parties had again recourse to arms, and the Templars were defeated with such terrible slaughter that all Europe was moved with compassion. Even their ancient rivals, the Hospitallers, sent them immediate succor, and from the commandery of St. John, at Clerkenwell alone, a body of 300 knights took their departure for the Holy Land. A council, likewise, was held about this time at Spoleto, where another crusade was announced. And Gregory IX, who combined in his person every inconsistency that ambition, bigotry, and avarice can produce, sent the Dominican and Franciscan friars to stimulate Europe to take the cross. No sooner had the crusade been preached, and the enthusiastic multitudes were ready to begin the journey, than Gregory and his agents persuaded many to compromise their vow, and, by paying a certain sum towards the expenses of the expedition, to fill the papal treasury under the pretense of assisting their brother Christians. Those who would not thus yield to his suggestions, he positively prohibited from setting out, and engaged the Emperor Frederick to throw impediments in their way when they pursued their purpose. Nevertheless, the King of Navarre, the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Brittany, and the Count de Bar proceeded to Palestine in spite of all opposition, and their coming was a very timely service to the defenders of the Holy Land. For no sooner had the period of his truce with the Christians expired than Camel, finding that preparations for war were making on their part, anticipated their efforts, retook Jerusalem, routed all the forces that could be opposed to him, and overthrew what was called the Tower of David. He died shortly after this victory, and on the arrival of the Crusaders, a prospect of success seemed open before them. But the operations of the chiefs were detached, and though the Count of Brittany gained some advantages towards Damascus, the rest of the French knights were completely defeated in a pitched battle at Gaza, and most of their leaders were either killed or taken. The King of Navarre was glad to enter into a disgraceful treaty with the Emir of Karak, which was conducted through the intervention of the Templars, and the rest of the Latins formed alliances with what neighboring powers they could. The Hospitallers, however, would not subscribe to the truce with the Emir of Karak through jealousy towards the Templars, and there was no power in the state sufficiently strong to force them to obedience. Shortly after this event, the King of Navarre returned to Europe, and Richard, Earl of Cornwall, with many knights and large forces, arrived in Palestine. Their expedition had been sanctioned by all the authorities of Europe, except the Pope. Henry III conducted them in person to the shore. The prayers and benedictions of the people and the clergy followed them, and their journey through France was accompanied by shouts and acclamations. On his arrival in Palestine, Richard instantly marched upon Jaffa, but he was met by envoys from the Sultan of Egypt, who was now at war with the Sultan of Damascus, offering an exchange of prisoners, and a complete cession of the Holy Land, with some unimportant exceptions. Richard instantly accepted such advantageous proposals. Jerusalem was given up to the Christians, the rebuilding of the walls was commenced, the churches were purified, and the Earl returned to Europe with the glorious title of the Deliverer of Palestine. The Templars would not be parties to this treaty, as the Hospitallers had refused to participate in the other, and thus one of the great military orders remained at war with the Sultan of Damascus, and the other with the Sultan of Egypt. While these events had been passing in Palestine, a new dynasty had sprung up in the north of Asia and threatened a complete revolution in the whole of that quarter of the world. Genghis Khan and his successors had overturned all the northern and eastern governments of Asia, and spreading over that fair portion of the earth precisely as the Goths and Huns had spread over Roman Europe, had reduced the more polished and civilized nations of the south by the savage vigor and active ferocity of a race yet in the youth of being. Among other tribes whom the successors of Genghis had expelled from their original abodes was a barbarous and warlike horde called the Chorasmins, and this people, wandering about without a dwelling, destroying as they went, and waging war against all nations, at length directed their course towards Palestine. So quick and unexpected had been their arrival that the Christians employed in the re-edification of the city walls never dreamed of invasion till fire and massacre had swept over half the Holy Land. No troops were collected, no preparations made, the fortifications of the city were incomplete, and the only resource of the people of Jerusalem was to retire in haste to the shelter of Jaffa under the guidance of the few Templars and Hospitallers who were on the spot. Some few persons remained, and made an attempt at defense, but the town was taken in a moment, and every soul in it put to the sword. The bloodthirsty barbarians, not satisfied with the scanty number of victims they had found, artfully raised the banner of the cross upon the walls, and many of the Latins who had fled returned. 7,000 more were thus entrapped and massacred, and the Chorasmins exercised every sort of barbarous fury on those objects they thought most sacred in the eyes of the Christians. At length, the fugitives at Jaffa received a succor of 4,000 men from their allies, the sultans of Emesa and Damascus, and resolved to give battle to the barbarians. The Patriarch of Jerusalem precipitated the measures of the army, and after a dreadful struggle, the Latins were defeated. The Grand Masters of the Temple and St. John slain, the 3 military orders nearly exterminated, and the Sultan of Emesa forced to fly for shelter to his fortifications. Walter de Brienne, the Lord of Jaffa, was taken, and to force that town to surrender, the Chorasmans hung the gallant knight by the arms to a cross, declaring to the garrison that he should there remain till the city was yielded. Walter heard, and raising his voice, unmindful of his own agonies, solemnly commanded his soldiers to hold out the city to the last. The barbarians were obliged to retire, and Walter was sent captive into Egypt. The Sultan of Emesa soon raised the standard a second time against the barbarians, and after several struggles, in which the monarch of Egypt sometimes upheld and sometimes abandoned the Chorasmans, they were at length entirely defeated, and not one, it is said, escaped from the field of battle. Barbaquan, their leader, was slain, and thus Asia was delivered of one of the most terrible scourges that had ever been inflicted on her. At this time, a monarch reigned over France, who combined in a remarkable degree the high talents of his grandfather, Philip Augustus, with the religious zeal, or perhaps I may say fanaticism, of his father, Louis VIII. Louis IX was in every respect an extraordinary man. He was a great warrior, chivalrous as an individual, and skillful as a general. He was a great king, inasmuch as he sought the welfare of his people more than the aggrandizement of his territories. He formed the best laws that could be adapted to the time, administered them often in person, and observed them always himself. He was a good man, inasmuch as he served God with his whole heart, and strove in all his communion with his fellows to do his duty according to his sense of obligation. Had he been touched with religious fervor to the amount of zeal, but not to the amount of fanaticism, he would have been perhaps too superior to his age. Previous to the news of the Chorasminian eruption, St. Louis had determined to visit the Holy Land, in consequence of a vow made during sickness. It appears that after the signal defeat which he had given to Henry III of England at Saintonge, Louis's whole attention was turned to the sufferings of the Christians in Palestine, and so deeply was his mind impressed with that anxious thought that it became the subject of dreams, which he looked upon as instigations from heaven. The news of the destruction of the Christians by the barbarians, the well-known quarrels and rivalry of the two military orders, and the persuasions of Innocent IV, who then held the 13th Ecumenical Council at Lyons, all hastened Louis's preparations. William Longsword and a great many English crusaders joined the French monarch from Great Britain, and after 3 years, careful attention to the safety of his kingdom, the provision of supplies, and the concentration of his forces, Louis, with his 2 brothers, the Counts of Artois and Anjou, took the scrip and staff and set sail for Cyprus. The 3rd brother of the king, Alfonso, Count of Poitiers, remained to collect the rest of the crusaders and followed shortly after. The Queen Consort of France and several other ladies of high note accompanied the monarch to the Holy Land. At Cyprus, Louis spent 8 months in healing the divisions of the military orders and endeavoring to bring about that degree of unity which had been unknown to any of the Crusades. At length, early in the spring, he set sail from Cyprus with an army of 50,000 chosen men. A tremendous storm separated the king's fleet, and supported by but a small part of his troops, he arrived at Damietta, where the Sultan of Egypt, with his whole force, was drawn up to oppose the landing of the Christians. The Sultan himself was seen in golden armor, which shone, Joinville says, like the sun itself, and so great was the noise of drums and trumpets that the French were almost deafened by the sound. After some discussion, it was determined that the landing should be attempted without waiting for the rest of the army. Among the first who reached the shore was Joinville, Seneschal of Champagne, who, accompanied by another baron and their men-at-arms, landed in the face of an immense body of Turkish cavalry that instantly spurred forward against them. The French planted their large shields in the sand, with their lances resting on the rim, so that a complete chevaux de frise was raised, from which the Turks turned off without venturing an assault. St. Louis himself soon followed, and in his chivalrous impatience to land, sprang into the water up to his shoulders, and sword in hand, rushed on to charge the Saracens. Intimidated at the bold actions of the French, the Moslems fled from the beach, and as the Crusaders advanced, the unexpected news of the death of their sultan reached the Saracens, upon which they abandoned even the city of Damietta itself, without waiting to destroy the bridge, though they set fire to the bazaars. At Damietta, Louis paused for the arrival of his brother, the Count of Poitiers, and the rest of the forces, and here, with the usual improvidence that marked all the Crusades, the army gave itself up to luxury and debauchery, which the king, neither by laws nor example, could check. At length the reinforcements appeared, and Louis, leaving the queen at Damietta, marched on towards Cairo. But near Massoura he found his advance impeded by the Thanisian Canal, on the other side of which the Saracens were drawn up to oppose his progress under the command of the celebrated Emir Saladin. No other means of passing the canal seemed practicable, but by throwing a causeway across. This was accordingly commenced under cover of two high movable towers called châteaux, or cat castles, which were scarcely raised before they were burnt by quantities of Greek fire thrown from the pierres and mangonels. At length an Arabian peasant agreed, for a large bribe, to point out a ford. The Count of Artois, with 1,400 knights, was directed to attempt it. He succeeded, repulsed the Saracens on the banks, and pursued them to Massoura. The panic among the Moslems was general, and Massoura was nearly deserted. The more experienced and prudent knights of all classes advised the Count of Artois to pause for the arrival of the king and the rest of the army. The Count, with passionate eagerness, accused his good counselors of cowardice. Chivalrous honor, thus assailed, forgot reason and moderation. Each one, more ardently than another, advanced into Massoura. The Moslems, recovered from their fear, returned in great numbers. The fight began in earnest, and almost the whole of the imprudent advance guard of the Christians was cut to pieces. The Count of Artois fell among the first, and when Louis himself arrived, all was dismay and confusion. The battle was now renewed with redoubled vigor. Louis fought in every part of the strife, and the French and Saracens seemed emulous of each other in the paths of glory and destruction. The sun went down over the field of Massoura, leaving neither army assuredly the victors. But the Saracens had been repulsed, and Louis remained master of the plain. Sickness and famine soon began to rage in the Christian camp. The Moslems had now interrupted the communication with Damietta, and every soldier in the army was enfeebled by disease. Negotiations were begun for peace, but were broken off, because the Sultan would receive no hostage for the evacuation of Damietta but Louis himself, and it was determined to attempt a retreat. Many strove to escape by the river, but were taken in the attempt, and the host itself was incessantly subject to the attacks of the Saracens, who hung upon its rear during the whole march, cutting off every party that was detached, even to procure the necessaries of life. In this dreadful state, Louis long continued to struggle against sickness, fighting ever where danger was most imminent, and bearing up when the hardiest soldiers of his army failed. At length he could hardly sit his horse, and in the confusion of the flight, which was now the character of the retreat, he was separated from his own servants, and attended only by the noble Godfrey de Bouillon, who defended him against all the attacks of the enemy. He was led to a hut at the village of Cazel, where he lay, expecting every moment that the plague would accomplish its work. He was thus taken by the Saracens, who assisted in his recovery and treated him with honor. The greater part of the army fell into the Moslems' power, but an immense number were slain and drowned in attempting their escape. Several difficulties now arose with regard to the ransom of the king, the Saracens demanding the cession of various parts of Palestine, still in the hands of the Christians. This, however, Louis refused, and conducted himself in prison with so much boldness that the Sultan declared he was the proudest infidel he had ever beheld. To humble him to his wishes, the torture of the barnacles was threatened, but the monarch remained so unmoved that his enfranchisement was at last granted on other terms. 10,000 golden besants were to be paid for the freedom of the army. The city of Damietta was to be restored to the Saracens, and a peace of 10 years was concluded. During the interval which followed these arrangements, the Sultan was assassinated, and the fate of St. Louis was again doubtful, but the murderers agreed to the same terms which had been before stipulated. Nevertheless, some acts of cruelty were committed, and a great number of the sick were massacred at Damietta. The treasure which the king possessed on the spot not being sufficient to furnish the whole ransom, his friends were obliged to seize upon the wealth of the Grand Master of the Temple, who basely refused to lend a portion to redeem his fellow Christians. At length, the first part of the sum was paid. The great body of the foreign nobles who had joined in the crusade returned to Europe, and Louis himself retired to Acre. The Saracens had already broken the treaty with Louis by the murder of the sick at Damietta and by the detention of several knights and soldiers, as well as a large body of Christian children. The promise of peace, therefore, was not imperative, and the Sultan of Damascus eagerly courted the French king to aid him in his efforts against the people of Egypt. The news of this negotiation immediately brought deputies from Egypt, who submitted to the terms which Louis thought fit to propose. And that monarch, without mingling in the wars that raged between the two Moslem countries, only took advantage of them to repair the fortifications of Jaffa and Caesarea. After having spent 2 years in putting the portion of Palestine that yet remained to the Latins into a defensible state, he set sail for France, where his presence was absolutely required. Before proceeding to trace the after fate of the Holy Land, it may be as well to conduct St. Louis to his last crusade. 16 years after his return to Europe, that monarch once more determined on rearing the banner of the cross. Immense numbers flocked to join him, and England appeared willing to second all the efforts of the French king. Edward, the heir of the English monarchy, assumed the cross, and large sums were raised throughout Britain for defraying the expenses of the war. In 1270, St. Louis, accompanied by the flower of his national nobility and followed by 60,000 chosen troops, set sail for Palestine, but was driven by a storm into Sardinia. Here a change in his plans took place, and it was resolved that the army should land in Africa, where the king of Tunis, some time before, had professed himself favorable to the Christian religion. St. Louis had been long so weak that he could not bear the weight of his armor nor the motion of a horse for any length of time, but still his indefatigable zeal sustained him, and after a short passage he arrived on the coast of Africa, opposite to the city of Carthage. Although his coming had been so suddenly resolved, a large Mohammedan force was drawn up to oppose his landing, but the French knights forced their way to the shore, and after a severe contest, obtained a complete victory over the Moors. Siege was then laid to Carthage, which was also taken, but before these conquests could be turned to any advantage, an infectious flux began to appear in the army. St. Louis was one of the first attacked. His enfeebled constitution was not able to support the effects of the disease, and it soon became evident that the monarch's days were rapidly drawing to their close. In this situation, with the most perfect consciousness of his approaching fate, St. Louis called his son Philip and spoke long to him on his duty to the people he left to his charge, teaching him with the beautiful simplicity of true wisdom. The king then withdrew his thoughts from all earthly things, performed the last rites of his religion, and yielded his soul to God. Scarcely was the monarch dead when Charles of Sicily arrived with large reinforcements, and, unknowing the event, approached Carthage with martial music and every sign of rejoicing. His joy was soon turned into grief by the tidings of his brother's fate, and the courage of the Moors being raised by the sorrow of their enemies, the united armies of France and Sicily were attacked by a very superior power. After a variety of engagements, Philip, now King of France, and Charles of Sicily compelled the defeated Moors to sue for peace, and collecting his troops, the new monarch returned to Europe, driven from the coast rather by the pestilence that raged in his army than by the efforts of the infidels. Prince Edward of England had taken the cross, as I have already said, with the intention of following Louis IX to the Holy Land, and with the small force he could collect, amounting to not more than 1,500 men, he arrived in the Mediterranean, but hearing that Louis had turned from the direct object of the crusade, he proceeded to Sicily, where he passed the winter. As soon as spring rendered navigation possible, he set sail and arrived at Acre, where he found the state of Palestine infinitely worse than it had been since the first taking of Jerusalem. Disunion and violence had done far more to destroy the Christians of the Holy Land than the swords of the infidels. The two military orders had been constantly opposed to each other and had often been engaged in sanguinary warfare. The Knights of St. John had ever the advantage, and at one time the Templars of Palestine had nearly been exterminated. The clergy attempted to encroach upon the privileges of both. The different Italian republics, who had secured to themselves various portions of territory and various commercial immunities, were in continual warfare. And while the Saracens and the Mamluks were gradually taking possession of the whole soil, while the fortresses of Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sapphori fell into the hands of the infidels, as well as all the cities and fiefs of the Latins, except Acre and Tyre, the sands of Palestine were often wet with Christian blood, shed by the hands of Christians. Antioch also fell almost without resistance, and the citizens were either doomed to death or led into captivity. Such was the state of the Holy Land at the time of Prince Edward's arrival. His name, however, was a host. The disunion among the Christians was healed by his coming. Every exertion was made to render his efforts effectual, and he soon found himself at the head of a small but veteran force, amounting to 7,000 men. With this, he advanced upon Nazareth, and after a severe conflict with the Moslems, he made himself master of that city, in which all the Saracens that remained were slaughtered without mercy. The climate put a stop to his successes. It was now the middle of summer, and the excessive heat brought on a fever, from which Edward was recovering, when a strange messenger desired to render some dispatches to the prince's own hand. He was admitted, and as the young leader lay in his bed, without any attendants, he delivered the letters, and for a moment spoke to him of the affairs of Jaffa. The instant after, he drew a dagger from his belt, and before Edward was aware, had stabbed him in the chest. The prince was enfeebled, but was still sufficiently vigorous to wrench the weapon from the assassin and to put him to death with his own hand. His attendants, alarmed by the struggle, rushed into the apartment and found Edward bleeding from the wound inflicted by a poisoned knife. Skillful means were instantly used to preserve his life, and an antidote, sent by the Grand Master of the Temple, is said to have obviated the effects of the poison. Edward's natural vigor, with care, soon restored him to health, and the Sultan of Egypt, daunted by the courage and ability of the English prince and engaged in ruinous wars in other directions, offered peace on advantageous conditions, which were accepted. Edward and his followers returned to Europe, and the Christians of Palestine were left to take advantage of a 10 years' truce. Such was the end of the last expedition. In 1274, Gregory X, who had himself witnessed the sorrows of Palestine, attempted to promote a new crusade and held a council for that purpose at Lyons, where many great and noble personages assumed the cross. The death of the Pope followed shortly afterward, and the project was abandoned on the loss of him who had given it birth. In Palestine, all now tended to the utter expulsion of the Christians. The Latins themselves first madly broke the truce by plundering some Egyptian merchants near Margat. Celadun, then Sultan of Cairo, hastened to revenge the injury, and Margat was taken from the Christians after a gallant defense. Tripoli, which had hitherto escaped by various concessions to the Moslems, fell shortly after Margat, and in the third year from that period, 200,000 Mohammedans were under the walls of Acre, the last possession of the Christians. The Grand Master of St. John had collected together a small body of Italian mercenaries, but no serviceable support could be won from the kings of Europe. The Grand Master of the Temple, however, with the rest of the military orders, and about 12,000 men, being joined by the King of Cyprus, resolved to undergo a siege. The greater part of the useless inhabitants were sent away by sea, and the garrison prepared to defend themselves to the last. This was the final blaze of chivalric valor that shone on the Holy Land. The numbers of the Moslems were overpowering, and after a breach had been made in the walls by the fall of what was called the Cursed Tower, a general assault took place. The King of Cyprus made a dastardly flight, but the Templars and the Teutonic Knights died where they stood, and the Hospitallers only left the city to attack the rear of the besieging army. Here they met with infinite odds against them, and fell man by man, till the news came that the Grand Master of the temple was killed and that the city was taken. The Hospitallers then, reduced to 7 in number, reached a ship and quitted the shores of Palestine. About an equal number of Templars fled to the interior, and thence fought their way through the land till they gained the means of reaching Cyprus. The inhabitants of the city who had not before departed fled to the sea, but the elements themselves seemed to war against them, and ere they could escape, the Saracen sword dyed the sands with their blood. The Moslems then set fire to the devoted town, and the last vestige of the Christian power in Syria was swept from the face of the earth.
This concludes today's reading of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.